Hello everyone, Mr. Lipchick here, and our discussion for this segment is going to be on expanding voting rights and how the franchise, as it is called, has grown and been extended to many different people throughout the history of the country. Okay, the history of voting rights. Today, the right to vote or suffrage is a fundamental right for almost all Americans age 18 or over. For much of the nation's history, however, many Americans could not vote. The history of the U.S. is one of suffrage being expanded to many groups and people. In colonial times, voting rights were limited mostly to white property-owning males who paid taxes. This was considered the stake in society theory, which believed that the best people to vote were those who owned property and therefore had a stake in what happened. Religious restrictions also existed in some states. In the early 1800s, the states abolished property requirements and religious restrictions. By the mid-1800s, there was universal white adult male suffrage. From the mid-1800s into the early 1900s, women's suffrage became a major movement in the United States. These fighters were known as suffragettes. This was part of a worldwide movement by women to liberate themselves and influence government. Women had to organize and fight for this right. Women were subject to being treated like children, legally and in practice. On the right, you see a picture of the suffragette getting beat up. They were seen by men as property, and the suffragettes were frequently jailed or beaten for their fight for voting rights. So it was a struggle. A lot of people look at the pictures and they say, "Oh, how cute that was." Well, it was a very dangerous and brutal struggle that they had to get the right to vote. Some of the states began to grant women suffrage. In 1920, the 19th Amendment granted female suffrage. It stated the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Politicians such as Woodrow Wilson saw new potential voter support among women and advocated female suffrage. In colonial times and in the early 1800s, very few African Americans could vote. The 15th Amendment was passed after the Civil War and ratified in 1870 and stated that no state could deprive any citizen of the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This amendment was enforced by U.S. troops during Reconstruction, but became ineffective when they were withdrawn. It was the first time the federal government set rules for voting. To the right, you see a picture of African American senators and representatives who were elected during the Reconstruction period, when African Americans were permitted to vote in the South. Southern states established the grandfather clause in order to block African Americans from voting. It set a requirement that in order to vote, your grandfather had to have voted before 1867. This, of course, was declared unconstitutional, but not until 1915. The literacy test was another method to prevent African Americans from voting. They were given complicated passages to read and were judged illiterate if they could not read them. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 and 1970 outlawed literacy tests. Poll taxes were another method of restricting voter rights. Poll taxes accumulated when you did not vote and had to be paid long in advance, discouraging voting. Poll taxes were outlawed by the 24th Amendment in 1964. State poll taxes were eliminated by the Supreme Court in 1966. Back one. Vernon Dahmer, an African-American grocer, was murdered by the KKK for helping African Americans to pay their poll tax. He allowed them to pay it in his store. Those KKK members were prosecuted. In the 1950s and 60s, the civil rights movement included efforts to register African Americans to vote throughout the South. Some civil rights activists were killed by the Ku Klux Klan. In 1964, 3 civil rights workers went missing and were later found buried in an earthen dam. In 1963, civil rights activist Medgar Evers was assassinated by white supremacists. He was shot to death in front of his family near his house. His killer was acquitted by an all-white jury. His wife fought for justice and eventually got his assassin convicted many years later. They actually had to exhume his body and remove a bullet fragment from him. And they found the rifle in the possession of somebody who got it from the killer. Finally, the Voting Rights Act was eventually passed. The Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and 60s resulted in the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This enabled the federal government to register voters in districts with less than 50% registration of African Americans. It forbade the creation of voting districts that diminished the effectiveness of the minority vote. And it provided for the appointment of poll watchers to monitor the voting process. To the right, you see a picture of President Johnson shaking hands with Martin Luther King after signing the Voting Rights Act. And it also abolished the literacy test. It also required ballots in the native languages of Spanish speakers, Native Americans, Asian Americans, and Aleuts, that is, Native Alaskans. The Voting Rights Act dramatically increased the participation of African Americans in politics. Thousands were elected to political office. Many became mayors of major northern cities. The 26th Amendment. During the 1960s, a generation of Americans known as the baby boomers were growing up. Most were better educated than their parents and outnumbered them. Many disagreed with their parents on many issues. They were frustrated that the voting age was 21. Thousands were drafted into serving in Vietnam, and they were 18, but were too young to vote. In 1971, the 26th Amendment was passed, which stated, "The right of citizens of the United States who are 18 years of age or older to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of age." There continue to be voting obstacles. In order to limit the turnout in primarily Democratic areas, Republican legislatures have passed laws requiring voter identification. Poor voters, mostly Democrats, often do not have the necessary identification documents. Supporters of these laws claim that the purpose is to stop voter fraud. Voter fraud is practically non-existent today. Once you register to vote, someone can't come and vote for you. It's just practically impossible. They would have to know whether or not you already voted, and it just is not something that can be pulled off. They have all the registered voters' names at the polling place. The courts have been ruling these laws unconstitutional. Also, 4 million U.S. citizens are not permitted to vote because they are convicted felons, even though they have served their sentences. Most are poor and supporters of parties and policies opposed by powerful and wealthy interests. 4 million votes could easily decide a presidential election. That concludes our discussion on expanding voter rights. Thank you for attending, and I look forward to seeing you in the live lesson. Have a great day.